The main themes of our talk focus on mobility as a phenomenon that occurs in the physical and, above all, socio-political space, in a historical milieu, we could say. It varies between cultures and within a culture, depending on the role of the site in the internal dynamics and in the broader network. So if mobility is a socially constructed act, then we need to know these societies as much as possible, and it is therefore more stimulating to select those contexts that have been targeted by extensive archaeological and osteological analysis, preferably published in monographs. And another point seems obvious. Things move with people. Raw materials, exotic artifacts, or even technologies are brought by travelers, traders, intermediaries. However, the exchange of tangible and intangible goods does not necessarily mean that the people who brought them were also integrated into the society. As today, we can have international ports of trade, trading on a global scale, which on the contrary might be substantially local from a demographic perspective. So mobility does not equate with social permeability. And finally, the last point, what is the role of the elite, of the few, in the establishment of the networks? So the aim of our X-Space project, which stands for Exploring Social Permeability in Ancient Communities of Europe, carried out at Durham University, but also in collaboration with the Austrian Academy of Science, the Hungarian Academy of Science, and the Museo delle Civiltà in Rome, is to analyze strontium and oxygen isotopes in 4 Bronze Age sites located in the Po Plain. These sites were selected among the best preserved and documented, but also because they effectively represent the sequence of socio-political developments that occurred during the Bronze Age, from the small village communities of the early Bronze Age, to the complex system of the Terramare, and finally, to the sophisticated international centers of the final Bronze Age. So the first site will be the early Bronze Age tumulus cemetery at Santa Eurosia, which can be dated at the beginning of the 2nd millennium and embodies the traditional communities, relatively small and organized around lineages. We will then talk about Middle and Late Bronze Age Terramare culture with its large village communities well established in the territory. We have selected 2 different contexts, diverse for location and size. Casinalbo Cremation Cemetery, this one, south of the Po River, associated with a relatively small settlement of 2 hectares. And the other one is Scalvinetto, north of the Po River, close to a 15-20 hectares large Terramara, whose name is Fondo Paviani, probably the central place of the so-called Valli Grandi Veronesi polity. Since Scalvinetto Fondo Paviani include both inhumations and cremations, it was also intriguing for us comparing the mobility between these 2 categories. And finally, we will show the changes in the mobility patterns that characterize Frattesina, the new attractive pole at the mouth of the Po River, which embodies the international sophisticated and, above all, hierarchical society of the final Bronze Age and early Iron Age, arising from the ashes of the Terramare system, which collapsed as a consequence of the 12th century crisis. So I guess that there is no need here to explain the method of strontium isotope analysis. So we know that strontium-87, strontium-86 ratios changes in relation to local geology. And tooth enamel is the target for inhumations. And as Karin showed before and in the article 2014, the petrous bone is a good target for cremations. So concerning the baselines, the first Italian strontium macro isoscape was recently published by Emery et al. 2018, but there are also important research projects on a smaller scale, for example in Emilia, an area that we have also targeted for Santa Eurosia and Scalvinetto. Of course, Italian current isoscape is not comparable in resolution to other areas of Europe, more extensively investigated, and certainly need to be refined, but it's a first step in a good direction, we believe. So with our project, we have integrated a 100 available baseline with 35 new baselines from plants, animals, and snails in order to cover the blank area of the isoscale, at least as much as possible. Here you see the geographical location of the sites and the geolithological map of northern Italy. So the Po Plain is an interesting area for applying biogeochemical research, as the Po River divides it into two principal sedimentary basins. One in the north, made of alpine sediments, originated from Paleozoic and Mesozoic bedrocks, and another one in the south, made of, as you can see here with the rivers, Cenozoic marine carbonates, so relatively recent. Therefore, macro difference occur as expected between the northern and the southern basin, with the Alps showing high strontium ratios, the area of Lessini and Colle Euganei with lower values, and Emilia with intermediate values, but comprised in a relatively narrow range. So north-south mobility is therefore better identifiable, while east-west trajectories across vast distances are more problematic. Thus, we can reasonably say that an individual is not indigenous, especially as Janet and Karin said before, that an individual is not indigenous, especially if its value fall outside the local distribution, but the determination of a precise provenance is less straightforward, since values in several districts can overlap. We can nonetheless make suggestions, as well as excluding some hypotheses formulated by archaeologists. In the attempt to mitigate the distinction, the sharp distinction between locals and non-locals, that these two categories often used, we have used a method also applied by Christoph Snook in Ireland, which consists in dividing the surroundings of the sites in different zones at progressively farther distance from the sites and compare human strontium values with the baseline at these three different radii. So the sites are located in a very flat and homogeneous areas, so it makes us more confident in applying the same dimensional criteria to all these four contexts. So the 5-kilometer radius is considered as the site catchment area, over which we assume the community exercise direct control and land exploitation. The 20-kilometer radius is regarded as the immediate hinterland, reachable by foot in less than 1 day of travel. And then the 50-kilometer radius is here considered the broader hinterland. So in theory, an incidence of exotic food might also have an impact on isotopic ratios. It seems unlikely, though, that Bronze Age communities in northern Italy traded in staple food, considering the high production capacity reached by the intensive agriculture, especially the Terramare. Recent works by Tafuri et al. Have also demonstrated that animals were fed with millet in the northern Terramare, so it is plausible that food was produced within few kilometers from the site. Here we go with the first one. So this is the typical assemblage of violin plots we use to represent the distribution of strontium isotope ratios of second molars. Each dot is an individual, and where the violin is a bit larger, you have the concentration of individuals, so it's a density also. On the left, in blue, there are adult male individuals, then in red, adult females, and in the green violin, subadults older than 3 years of age. On the right side, we put the baselines at 5 kilometers, 5 20 kilometers, and 20 50 kilometers. In the area of the early Bronze Age site at Santa Eurosia, the baseline range is quite narrow, as expected for the Emilian Plain. And if we compare the three baseline ranges with the human values, we observe three main things. One, except 2 adult males, all the individuals fall within the 50-kilometer range. Subadults are concentrated in a narrow interval, close to the 5-kilometer baseline, while the adults are more dispersed. And male and female show similar distribution, as you can see. So the general picture is therefore compatible with two possible models. One, of a mobile community in the territory across generations, including few male outsiders. And the option B, with different communities dispersed in the territory, burying their dead in a kind of central cemetery. But this latter seems less probable, because different individuals from the same tumulus do not show homogeneous values. And now we move towards Middle and Late Bronze Age Terramare, the complex system of the Terramare. The investigated site is Casinalbo, a 2-hectare Terramara dated between 1500 and 1150 BC, with an associated cemetery of more than 600 urn cremation excavated so far. So the violin plot shows that the majority of adult males at Casinalbo are concentrated close to the 5-kilometer baseline, with the exception of few outsiders. Female and subadults are dispersed within a wider radius, mostly compatible with the immediate hinterland, and less frequently with the broader hinterland. In our view, this picture describes a clear patrilocal structure with exogamy practiced mainly within limited distance from the Terramara. The variability of children might also point to movement of entire families or maybe foster age practices. It is also interesting to notice that, similar to other European contexts like those of Karen, for example, females with richer grave goods tend to cluster separately from the more local women without grave goods. On the other side of the Po River, the situation of the large Terramara at Fondo Paviani and Scalvinetto appears rather different. Fondo Paviani is 6 or 7 times larger than Casinalbo, the site before, and participated in much broader networks. This is also suggested by the presence of exotic materials such as Baltic amber and, above all, Aegean Mycenaean pottery, which is locally manufactured, that implies the movement of artisans. As all other cemeteries of the northern Terramare district, Scalvinetto includes both inhumations and cremations. Inhumations are located on the western part of the cemetery, while cremations are clustered in barrier groups on the eastern side, with an area of overlap in the middle. Inhumations are usually considered more ancient, from the Middle Bronze Age, and cremation mostly from the recent Bronze Age, so a bit more recent. And our sample comprises 30 inhumations and 30 cremations. So if we compare the variability of strontium isotopes ratios at Fondo Paviani, Scalvinetto in green, with Santa Rosa and Casinalbo, we see a substantial increase, which is partially determined by a broader variability of the geolithologies north of the Po River, but also by a much more intense human mobility. Among inhumations, subadults falls as expected within the 5-kilometer baselines. Females show a wide range of isotope ratios, both from the immediate and broader hinterland, but also from far away. Males, on the contrary, appear mostly local or from the immediate hinterland, with one exception, the one above. We can add oxygen isotopes to the strontium results to attempt to clarify the frequency of non-locals. Oxygen isotope composition varies as a consequence of the composition of ingested water, mostly driven by latitude and altitude. So in this scatter plot and density plots together, you can see both strontium in the y-axis and oxygen in the x-axis from the second molar enamel. Oxygen analysis on apatite carbonates allowed us to discriminate among those individuals who share a similar strontium isotope composition. If we consider oxygen as a good proxy for the individual provenance, then the number of outsiders increases substantially, up to the 47% of the overall series. The cluster with the high oxygen values might reflect a group of people, mainly females, coming from a warmer area. The south of Italy or even Greece are, for example, good candidates, also considering the presence of Aegean Mycenaean type pottery. For 3 non-indigenous individuals, 1 male and 2 females, we have also analyzed the third molar. We are therefore able to see if movements occurred between childhood and adolescence. Interestingly, we see that number 313 probably reached Fondo Paviani before the formation of the M3, therefore during late childhood, while 246 and 405 were moving during adolescence, but probably reached Fondo Paviani slightly later. Again, comparing oxygen isotope at Sant'Eurosia and Scalvinetto, we observe a substantial increase of the variability and therefore of the amount of non-local, which goes along with the increasing complexity that characterized the socio-political changes from the early to the middle-late Bronze Age. And just for comparison, the amplitude of Scalvinetto oxygen isotope ratio is not so dissimilar from that of imperial necropolises in Rome, published by Christina Kilgore and Janet in 2016. So assuming that imperial Rome represents an extremely dynamic and mobile world, we might argue more or less the same for a Bronze Age central place. The analysis of oxygen contained in the enamel carbonates also enables to obtain delta C13 data. Delta C13 values on appetite are correlated to those of collagen, although contrarily to bone, enamel do not remodel during lifetime. So usually delta C13 of collagen is around 7 per mil lower than enamel appetite. The scatter plot clearly shows 2 clusters, one with lower values, possibly characterized by major consumption of C3 plants, and another group of individuals which indicates more significant C4 intake, presumably millet. Individual number 313, at the bottom, has changed diet when she moved from a distant place to Scalvinetto, Fondo Paviani. In fact, if we look at the data produced by Marianta Furi et al. On collagen, cultivation and consumption of millet was introduced by the Terramare people, here in the green violin. It was not or scarcely present before, the pink violin and on the left. And above all, it was absent in other neighboring coeval cultures, such as the Istrian Castellieri, which is the brown violin. So it seems that delta C13 could be a marker of provenance, at least for this specific period and geographic areas. For cremation, we can rely, as you know, only on strontium. The isotope spectrum appears more limited compared to inhumations. And again, subadults match with the 5-kilometer baseline. Males are more dispersed than females. Both groups seem largely compatible with the hinterland. What we have seen so far suggests that in the Terramare, the degree of social permeability to outsiders depends, as one could expect, on the dimension and demographic capacity of the center, and therefore on its political role. Casinalbo acts more inside its own polity, while Fondo Paviani seems more connected and open to the rest of the world. Here it seems appropriate to argue that a certain overlap exists between social complexity and social permeability, so that one mirrors the other. However, the mirror is shortly going to shatter. We know that after the global Mediterranean crisis of the 12th century, the Terramare system collapsed, and the Pope Lane experienced a phase of depopulation and reorganization, from which Frattesina rose as the new pole, attracting exotic goods from continental Europe, Africa, Near East. We might expect a high degree of human mobility and social permeability, even higher than Scalvinetto, Fondo Paviani. We instead observe exactly the opposite. Strontium isotope ratios of 45 individuals seem to indicate a certain degree of mobility of Frattesina, but mainly on the scale of the hinterland. There are no significant difference between males and females, and subadults also moved with within the same radius. However, if we divide the individuals in 3 classes, yesterday we were talking about classes in the late Bronze Age, according to grave good assemblages, where 1 in yellow on the left is the first class with indicators of prestige, 2 in red is the middle class with less prestigious grave goods, and 3 in green are the poor with no grave goods at all, we see that mobility characterizes the richest, while the poorest are more local. So in this historical phase, or at least in this site, mobility and inequalities are strictly entwined. Among the richest, at the very apex of Frattesina community, there are two individuals, number 168 and number 227, and they are the only two out of 1,000 burials which contain a sword. We must therefore be in front of two warrior chiefs. Of number 168, we have analyzed both petrous bone and femur cortical to obtain the strontium signature of childhood and adulthood, respectively. So while femur shows the typical local signal of the Frattesina area, the petrous bone is incompatible. So the warrior chief is therefore a ruling outsider who came to Frattesina several years before his death. Nonetheless, he may not have been a complete stranger, since his closest possible origin is the Fondo Paviani area. But the important and more certain thing is that we can exclude other areas, such as Greece or the Levant, which were previously suggested by some archaeologists. 168 and maybe 227 emphasize what we can call the transformative power of the few. They represent two prominent subjects who broke the rigid austerity of the former Terramare ritual, which for centuries excluded weapons from burials. In some ways, together with a small entourage, they probably violated the heterarchic and cooperative spirit that characterized the Terramare society and led the change towards a more hierarchical system, which probably was more suitable to legitimate Frattesina with local and foreign trading partners. After a phase of collapse, the first goal of the elite was probably to re-establish control and relationship with the territory and create the political stability that could strengthen the role of the center in the global arena. That is why Frattesina population appeared, to a large extent, indigenous or at most local or from the region. So this means that the expansion of commercial networks in some cases might not coincide with an increase of the permeability to outsiders. So depending on the historical milieu we are analyzing, mobility of people and things might or might not coincide. Probably they do in phases of growth and prosperity, and they tend to split in times of instability. In these periods, then as today, humans may still desire exotic goods, but not exotic people. Let us propose a final reflection about ancient DNA. We will never know if there is genetic continuity between the Terramare and Frattesina, as cremation predominates in the Urnfield period. What we know is that there are more archaeological, osteological, and isotopic clues for continuity than for change. However, society changed radically, and this transformation was probably triggered by an influential minority, a bunch of powerful incomers. This poses a caveat and a question. The caveat regards how we choose samples, especially in the Bronze Age context, where mobility is so intense and on long distances. Are we actually sampling representatives of the local populations? And second, given that we cannot use ancient DNA on burned human remains, how can we deal with the Urnfield period? Thank you.